Good evening. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's Moosnick lecture, the first of this year's Monroe Moosnick Lecture Series in Judaic Studies. Thank you for joining us. My name is Carol Barnsley, and I am Associate Professor and Program Director of the Religion Program here at Transylvania University. I am delighted to represent Transylvania University and play host to this prestigious lecture series, which is made possible by the kind commitment of many in terms of funding, location, time, and energy. A little history on the series. The Monroe Moosnick Lecture Series was established a number of years ago by a collaborative effort to provide an opportunity for interfaith dialogue. This endeavor has been enabled by the generous support of the Rosenthal and Moosnick families, as well as the Lexington Theological Seminary and the Jewish community of Central Kentucky. The series was specifically conceived as an interfaith effort to educate our Lexington community about Judaism and Jewish scholarship. Transylvania University is pleased to co-sponsor and host this annual event. The lecture is a two-part series with tonight's lecture here at Transylvania. Please join us tomorrow for the second in the series at Ohavei Zion Synagogue, where Rabbi Shani Abramovitz has graciously opened their doors to us. It will take place at 7, and please do register beforehand. In the past years, we have welcomed such speakers as Rabbi Dr. Myra Wasserman, Dr. Amanda Mbuvi, and Dr. Melissa Clapper, just to name a few. This year's topic revolves around Jewish culture, with a discussion of Yiddish writers in particular, and how the language, people, and culture played a significant role in resistance in various contexts. I will leave the introduction of our speaker, however, to Taylor McGarvey, a Transylvania senior religion major. Before turning things over to Taylor, there are a great many people I need to thank, and I'm sure I'll be remiss and forget someone. Forgive me. To begin, the Moosnick Committee, including Reverend Dr. Loida Mattel, Rabbi David Wirtschafter, Rabbi Shani Abramowitz, Dr. Beth Goldstein, and Dr. Rosie Moosnick. I would also like to thank Elena Henderson, who just began her tenure here as the Administrative Assistant for the Humanities. She has been instrumental in coordinating all the moving parts that such a lecture entails. Thank you, Elena. Thank you to Erin Sheno and Bon Appetit for the delicious pre-lecture meal. Thank you to Greg Posner and his team here in the MFA. Thank you to Interim Chief Gowdy and his team with DPS. Thank you to Megan Maloney and Julie Martinez for the publicity and coordinating the live streaming for our off-campus constituents. Thank you to our Dean, Dr. Rebecca Thomas, and our President, Mr. Brian Lewis, for your ongoing support of the humanities and this lecture series. And lastly, thanks again to the Moosnick and Rosenthal families for envisioning this lecture series and then making it happen. I now turn things over to Taylor, a double biochem and religion major who will graduate this coming May. She gets the honor of introducing our illustrious speaker.
Thank you, Dr. Barnsley. Dr. David E. Fishman is a professor of Jewish history at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America. He also serves as director of Project Judaica, JTS's program in Ukraine, which is based at the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences in Kyiv. Among its various activities, Project Judaica publishes guides to Jewish materials in Ukrainian archives. Dr. Fishman is the author of numerous books and articles on the history and culture of Eastern European Jewry. His most recent book, The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazis, has been hailed as Monuments Men for book lovers and first-rate scholarship that pulses with the beat of a most human heart. His previous books include Russia's First Modern Jews and The Rise of Modern Yiddish Culture, Dr. Fishman has edited 2 volumes of the Yiddish writings of Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik and is currently the editor of the bi-weekly newsletter, The War in Ukraine Jewish News. He is a member of the Academic Committee of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which if you ever get the chance, I strongly recommend to visit. And as a native New Yorker, Dr. Fishman travels frequently to Ukraine and Eastern Europe for lecturing, research, and administration of Project Judaica. Join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Fishman.
Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm having a strange feeling because this is my first visit ever to Lexington, Connecticut. There you are, Kentucky. But I've met people like I feel like I know them. There are a couple people I do know, but I've been welcomed so warmly by Professor Barnsley, by President Lewis, by other people that I'm a little confused about am I in a new environment or in a familiar environment? Thank you, all of you, for being so warm in your welcome. I'm going to talk tonight about, well, the time frame is about the most tragic period in Jewish history, the Holocaust. But the story I'm going to tell you is fundamentally uplifting and inspiring. It's a kind of paradox to talk about such a painful and tragic period, but actually, I hope you'll leave this talk in some ways feeling good and feeling inspired by this story, which is the story of the rescue of books, manuscripts, papers, documents from the Nazis by ghetto inmates. That is, who risked their lives for a year and a half to smuggle the books away from the Nazis. And those materials exist today. Thanks to, they exist in New York, they exist in Lithuania, they exist in Jerusalem, thanks to their heroism. This is a very short version of my book, The Book Smugglers, which has appeared in various languages. I'm just showing you the Hebrew translation. I mainly recommend it because I often think my book is much better than my lecture, right? So I can't, if you think the lecture isn't that good, then all I will say is, well, then you must go read the book, which is much, much better. I will begin on a kind of autobiographical note and take you back to myself, well, I'll be honest, 35 years ago. I was a fresh PhD, young assistant professor. It's 1989. And I get a phone call from the director of the YIVO Institute, an institute for the study of East European Jewry in New York. And we knew each other, and he calls me, he says, David, we just found out there are mountains and mountains of Jewish books and papers in a former church, St. George's Church, in Vilnius, Soviet Lithuania. Yes, it's still the Soviet Union then. And will you go with me to Vilnius to take a look at this? What is this? Why are there mountains of Jewish books in what had been a church? And I went, and I was amazed by the riches, by the wealth, by the diversity of material from different periods, different types of material, religious, secular, political, a kaleidoscope of all of Jewish history in this structure. And of course, I was curious, what's the story? Not only what is the content, but how did this material end up here? And I started to piece together the story. I wrote an essay. And in the back of my mind, I thought, well, someday this can be a book. I think there's enough material to make it a book. And I was right, and so I'm going to share the book that eventually emerged. The story takes place in the city, I'll call it Vilna. Today it is Vilnius, the capital of independent Lithuania. But before World War II, actually, Vilna belonged to Poland. It's a part of the world where borders shifted a lot. Jews called this community, their community in Vilna, the Jerusalem of Lithuania, Yerushalayim Delita, which is a very special name. Not that many Jewish communities in history have gotten the nickname Jerusalem, a kind of sanctity and halo. Its special claim to fame was a tradition of scholarship and book learning and book culture, I would say. I would call Vilna the Jewish city of the book. This tradition begins with an 18th century rabbi, the Gaon of Vilna, the genius of Vilna, Rabbi Elijah, who wrote literally on every nook and cranny of the Jewish religious tradition, the Bible, the Talmud, the Midrash, mystical literature, legal literature, etc., and was famous for really devoting himself to learning above all else. Above all else, as a rabbi, he devoted himself to learning, and that establishes a tradition of bookishness, I would say, in this community. Vilna was a great center of Hebrew printing. You're seeing on the left a volume of a Talmud printed in Vilna. If you know Hebrew letters, you can see the word Vilna in red at the bottom. And later, this city, in other words, this is the top city for publishing, for Jewish publishing, whether it's prayer books or whether it's newspapers. Between the two world wars, that is, between 1918 and 1939, there were 5 daily newspapers in the Yiddish language, in the Jewish language, published in this city of Vilna. Vilna only had, on the eve of the war, 70,000 Jews. It's not the largest Jewish community in Eastern Europe. Warsaw, on the eve of the war, had 350,000 Jews, many, many more. But it was, I often compare it, I don't have comparisons for, maybe I should call it the Lexington of East European Jewry, but I usually refer to it as something like Oxford or Cambridge. In other words, it's not London, it's not the biggest place on earth, but it has a history and a tradition of kind of intellectual excellence and of reading. The Jewish communal library, and it was indeed a library, not a classical Talmudic house of study, but a library. The Strashun Library was attached, when it was built, to the Great Synagogue, and that was a symbolic statement. There's prayer, but reading of all kinds is integral to life, and this library, the Strashun Library, was the greatest Jewish library under Jewish auspices in Europe before the Holocaust. It had many incunabula, that's books printed before 1501. There aren't a lot of Hebrew incunabula books printed before 1501. It had many rarities. This is the interior, the reading room of that library. Vilna was also the site, I need to give you this background so you understand the story that follows. The site of YIVO, now in New York, but until World War II, based in Vilna, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which had the greatest Jewish archive. That is personal records of great writers, communal records of organizations and synagogues, manuscripts, and even ephemera, the kind of things we all throw away. You know, a placard about a theater show. Well, this archive kept all of that. And it was a kind of a Jewish research institute. And there are many other collections I don't even have time to go over, but the greatest collections of Jewish books in this city. This will be important because the Nazis knew about Vilna. I may need to explain to you more about Vilna, but the Nazi specialists knew that this is a gem if you're interested in Jewish books and papers. And there were also writers, creative people. Where there are readers and publishers and scholars, there often tend to be writers. And this is the literary group Young Vilna. And I want to point out two of the members of this literary group. I can't go through all of them. Well, let's start in the middle. This is Shmerke Kaczerginski. That's a very hard name to pronounce, but I'll just call him Shmerke. He is the central figure in this group, a poet, a political poet. He's a man of the left. He's actually a member of the underground Communist Party in Poland, and quite an amazing personal story. That is, he was an orphan. Both his parents died during World War I of disease and hunger. So he's raised in an orphanage. Doesn't happen that often that someone raised in an orphanage becomes a poet, but he did. And he's very popular as a poet, and also on the personal level, a very popular person. Everybody's his best friend. And the other writer, this one, is Abraham Sutzkever. He is very different than his friend Shmerke. He is the grandson of a rabbi, comes from a middle-class family. He is a nature poet and an absolute aesthete. In other words, the only thing he loves is poetry. He's not political at all. Not a socialist, not a Zionist, not anything. He says, my ideology is poetry. And these are, these people, the two of them will be central to the story that will ensue. Okay, now let's get to the body of the story. This is maps of the Vilna ghetto under Nazi occupation. The Nazis seized Vilna at the end of June 1941. Not September 1939, when they first attacked Poland, but as part of their campaign against the Soviet Union in June 1941. So they come much later than, let's say, to Warsaw, but they act much more quickly. Yes, they create a ghetto. Again, the Jewish population on the eve of the Nazi invasion was 70,000. I'll go to the bottom line. In half a year, the Jewish population of Vilna decreases from 70,000 to 20,000. That is, in the second half of 1941, more than 2/3 of the Jewish population of Vilna is murdered. They are murdered, they're not in death camps. Death camps don't exist yet, places like Auschwitz in the second half of 1941. Instead, they're taken to the outskirts of the city and mowed down by machine gun, what we now call the Holocaust by bullets, in a place called Ponar or Ponari or Panerai, depending on the language you're using, in waves, gradually, beginning in July, continuing through December. That's a period of great turmoil and fear. And then, in January 1942, the mass murder stops. The systematic mass murder of the Jews of Vilna stops, and the 20,000 that remain in the Vilna Ghetto will remain there for the next year and a half. There are all kinds of small atrocities. I don't have time to discuss them. But there is nothing as large or systematic as there had been previously. That's the period of stability of the Vilna Ghetto, that year and a half. And during that year and a half, most ghetto inmates, again, the ghetto is walled, it is enclosed, non-Jews are not allowed to enter, except for the Germans themselves occasionally will enter, but no inhabitant. It's totally a sealed section of the city. And the inhabitants, most of them, work outside the ghetto. It could be a shop or a factory. It can be a train depot. They're slave laborers for the Germans. And they leave in the morning and come back in the evening. At the ghetto gate, this is the gate to the, there are guards. Actually, there are 3 types of guards. Well, mainly 2, but sometimes 3. There are Lithuanian police. There are Jewish ghetto police, that is, the internal police force the Germans required Jews have for the ghetto. And then there are the Germans themselves, who are there only from time to time. The reason that matters is because inmates, because the official food rations are so meager, official food rations are, almost starvation diets, the way the ghetto survives is by smuggling food into the ghetto. How do you smuggle food in? Well, the most common way is underneath your clothes when you return from the work site. You try to barter something or get something, whether it's potatoes or a loaf of bread or something, hide it under your clothes and get it in. The most dangerous moment when you enter the ghetto gate is if there are Germans at the gate. The Jewish ghetto police are not very strict, and even the Lithuanian police are not particularly strict. But Germans, if they find someone smuggling food into the ghetto, at the very least will beat them, will whip them, will torture them. There's a little booth nearby where they would take people just to beat them. And in many cases will literally send them to Ponar, to the mass murder site, to their deaths. One famous case was there was a popular classical singer in Vilna and in the Vilna ghetto, kind of an opera singer and classical singer, Luba Levitskaya, and she hid a bag of peas which hung from her neck and underneath her clothing. But the Germans found those peas, and Luba Levitskaya was sent to her death because of that bag of peas. So life is grim, but it's better than systematic mass murder. Now I need to introduce the core of our topic, which is this organization, the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, the ERR, the Rosenberg Special Detail. This is the major looting agency of Nazi Germany for looting cultural treasures. If you saw Monuments Men or read the book Monuments Men, you know about the ERR. It looted art from museums in Paris, in Amsterdam. It looted books from national libraries. The basic idea was the master race should have the greatest library, the greatest museum. None of the true cultural treasures of the world should belong to anyone other than to the Germans. And therefore, it's a looting agency that was active all across Europe, even as far south as, let's say, as Greece. Okay, from Greece to Amsterdam, if you can imagine that, and everywhere in between. What's not very well known, is that the ERR had a Judaica department, a department that was just to collect Jewish material, Jewish books, Jewish art, manuscripts, documents. Now you may be wondering why the ERR has, and this is Dr. Johannes Paul, the head of that Judaica department. It is paradoxical. Yes, the ERR was collecting, if you can call it that, actually stealing, Jewish books from great libraries and museums all across Europe. Why are they doing that? In other words, at the same time that they're murdering Jews, they're collecting, quote unquote, Jewish books. The answer is the Nazis have believe in scholarship and in science, and they have a field of scholarship called Judenforschung, study of the Jews, which is anti-Semitic Jewish studies. In other words, the purpose is to show in scholarly terms how evil and depraved the Jews are, how harmful they are, and to use all the methods of the social sciences and humanities, whether it's anthropology or whether it's religious studies or whether it's history and literature, all for the same goal, to justify the persecution and eventually extermination of the Jews in scholarly terms. These Jewish books are needed as the raw material so that scholars, anti-Semitic Nazi scholars, can produce Judenforschung. That's why they are collecting this material. Johannes Paul, I don't have time to go into his biography, but he had been trained as a Catholic priest. He spent time studying in Rome, and he spent time studying in Jerusalem. What matters most is he had command of biblical Hebrew and of modern Hebrew, and it was easy for him to pick up Yiddish. And Paul knows if there's one important place on the map where we must get the Jewish books and papers, it's Vilna. He knows about Evo, he knows about the Strashun Library, the community library, and he comes to Vilna literally 10 days after the Germans conquer the city for his first sort of survey of the territory. And even he is surprised. There are just so many books and so many treasures. And you just can't, do one little trip in and seize material and send it by train to Germany. You're going to have to, because there's just too much. And by the way, there are duplicates and triplicates and quadruplicates, and you don't need to send 4 copies of the same book to Germany. So he decides he needs to do what the Germans do early on, which is create a slave labor brigade that will do sorting, what to send to Germany and what not to send to Germany. And of course, who can do that? They don't have a lot of specialists, spare specialists to send to Vilna. So you take Jews from the ghetto. You take actually Jewish intellectuals, or at least the surviving Jewish intellectuals. When you've gone down from 70,000 to 20,000, most Jewish intellectuals have already been murdered, but there's still a significant remainder of people who you get to do these sorting. It's just an example of a book, a Hebrew book, with the stamp of the ERR and its academic wing, the Institute for the Investigation of the Jewish Question. The heads of this slave labor brigade, which gets the nickname the Paper Brigade, because all they deal with is papers. But there are 2 heads, Hermann Kruk, a professional librarian, and politically a socialist, a Bundist, means he belonged a Jewish Social Democratic Party, the Bund, which was very popular. He believes that education and books are the way for the working class to rise and to grow and to flourish and eventually to rule. And his deputy is Zelig Kalmanovich, a scholar from that Evo Institute. I showed you the Yiddish Institute. an amazing scholar of Jewish literature from antiquity to the present. At this stage, a man who went through many ideological transformations, but at this stage, he is a religious believer and a Zionist. He has a son who lives in the land of Israel when he's in the ghetto, and that's his great consolation. One day, walking to work, he says to a coworker, "They can't do anything to me, the Germans, because I have a son in the land of Israel." In other words, my future, my legacy is assured. They work together, even though they're ideologically opposites. And our two poets, the ones I talked about before, Schmerke on the left and Sutzkever on the right. Right, so we have a librarian, a scholar, two poets, you've got educators, an artist or two, a musician or two. Really, it is a kind of mix of all kinds of intellectuals. And the last person, I want to spend a moment on that, between Schmerke and Sutzkever, is Rochel or Rachela Krinsky. Rochel Krinsky, well, the short thumbnail would be to say she's a high school history teacher. She has a master's degree from Vilna University. She knows Latin. She knows Old Polish. She's a very educated woman. But what matters to us is her personal story. Her husband was seized in the very first roundups of Jews in Vilna in July 1941. So she is a widow, a young widow. They have a toddler daughter, 1.5 years old. And when the order comes that all Jews must go to the ghetto, she decides she's not taking her daughter into the ghetto. That's a death trap. And she hands her daughter over to her Polish nanny. She has a nanny at the home who's Polish, ethnic Pole. And the nanny takes the daughter, moves to another part of the city, and raises the daughter as if it were her own, as if, in other words, raises her daughter, Sarah, as Irena, as if she were a Polish Catholic child. And so Rachel Krinsky goes into the ghetto alone. Now, her husband is dead, her daughter is on the outside with the nanny. She won't see that daughter for many years. Okay, and the work begins. It's all about sorting books. The Germans create a quota, only 30% to Germany. You can't send everything to Germany. 70% must be destroyed. If it's not to be sent to Germany, it's going to be discarded as trash. They have a system for recycling paper. So 70% is destruction, 30%, no more than 30%. And as you can see, and the work site is actually the building of that Yiddish Institute, of the YIVO, which is outside the ghetto. So that these people are walking every day from the ghetto, 20 minutes, to the work site, sorting material. And at the end of the day, well, we'll come to that. They will hide papers and books under their clothing. But I wanted to stress this point. Everything is either destruction or Germany. This is, well, I will mention the one exception already. The one exception are Torah scrolls. The holiest object in Judaism is the scroll of the 5 books of Moses, which is read in the synagogue on the Sabbath, Mondays and Thursdays as well. It's written on parchment. Parchment is leather, not paper. And therefore, the Germans, and a lot of Torah scrolls in Vilna, cut up the Torah scrolls to use them as inserts to repair Nazi army boots, right? So again, for Jews, this is the ultimate desecration, right? To cut up the holiest object in Judaism, the holiest book in Judaism, and just to use it, for boots. And I would say maybe this image is the image to keep in mind when you understand what these people decided to do. They can't live with themselves. They are being forced to collaborate in the destruction of their own culture, right? They have to see, they store it, and then whatever is trash, they see, the bulldozers come, or other trucks come, and take it away, but they literally see with their own eyes the destruction of their own culture. And they're all book lovers. They're all readers. In fact, when the Germans aren't there, some of them will stop working and just pick up a book to read, poetry. So it's excruciating for them. And that's why they decide, almost as a personal, existential imperative, they have to do something. They have to resist. And the way to resist is to rescue whatever they can. And the main way they rescue material is the way we discussed. You put it underneath your clothing. Winters are great. You can put it in your boots, under your coat. Not everything can be rescued that way. There are other ways. But that way, you take materials back into the ghetto, which is Jewish territory. In other words, only inhabitants of the ghetto are Jews. And you hide it there. But the moment of truth is at the gate. Because if there are Germans at the gate, smuggling papers is just as bad as smuggling potatoes and can lead to your being sent to your death. A couple of members of this paper brigade were caught and were beaten very badly, but none of them were sent to their deaths. They were just plain lucky that way. And okay, there are many stories of what happens at the gate, but they're mainly stories of either audacity or luck. I guess I should tell one story. So Sutzkever took a big folio volume that was damaged. Literally, he couldn't hide it under his clothing. It's a big folio volume. He carried it there, and he simply said to the German, "My boss asked me to repair this folio volume, to tie it up, to bind the binding." And the German believed it because, come on, who is going to make up a story like that, right? And he said, okay, if your bosses at the paper brigade said so, go ahead. So, and that's just the audacity and creativity. When they take it into the ghetto, they hide it in many different hiding places, but the biggest place is literally a bunker. You enter through a manhole, it's a sewage, and there was a construction engineer who built this bunker, which is 15, 20 feet below ground. And this bunker was used to hide books and papers. It was also used by the armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto when they found arms, when they got arms, to keep guns. So in a sense, you have these two forms of resistance right next to each other. The guns for armed resistance, the books for this kind of spiritual resistance, which is we will not let our culture be destroyed. Let me just mention one thing to clarify. There are about 40 people who work in the entire paper brigade. Let's say 30 of them carried in material under their clothing. Let's say that they can carry 3 items a day under their clothing. They work there for 150 days. Okay, I'm not doing the math, okay, but it's 30 times 3 times 150. My point is, if anybody's got a calculator, you tell me 30 times 3 is 90 times 150. The point is you're making, You can rescue thousands upon thousands of items this way, slowly but surely, day by day. There are other ways. I'm only going to mention one other way they rescue material, which is with the help of non-Jewish friends. This is Anna Shemaitya, who was a ethnic Lithuanian socialist, worked before the war in the Vilnius University Library. She had a lot of Jewish friends from the university library. And that's important because, well, first of all, she literally was the only non-Jew who entered the Vilna ghetto. She entered the ghetto, but also with audacity. She went over to the German guards and said, I work in the Vilnius University Library. Ghetto inmates, when they went into the ghetto, took overdue books. I've got to go into the ghetto to collect the books for the university library. Again, when you come up with such an audacious excuse as that, the German guards believed her. She went in, she met with people, she talked with, encouraged them. Sometimes she would bring in food or bring in letters. And when she left, because she did this several times, sometimes she would take out papers and books that the paper brigade had taken into the ghetto. She took it out of the ghetto to hide it somewhere else in the city. And one time she left the ghetto, and under her coat, it was a fall day, she took a little Jewish girl and hid that girl in her home. That girl survived and later moved to Israel. Ona Shemaitya is one of the first people that Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Institute in Jerusalem, named as a righteous Gentile, as a righteous among the nations back in the 1960s, one of the very first people declared. And Ona Shemaitya, through a variety of ways I can't go into, rescued a lot of material. Well, I can't resist telling you. She visited the work site, the paper brigade work site, which was, after all, outside the ghetto, several times during the lunch hour. The Germans took a long lunch break and didn't leave anyone to guard the facility during lunch. Believe me, no one's going to escape. If you escape, they'll kill your whole family. They'll kill your whole apartment. There's collective punishment. And by the way, where are you going to go and who's going to help you if you escape? So they're not worried about that. And the Germans leave for the lunch hour, and Ona Shemaitya would come during the lunch hour. And besides talking with her friends, she would take out bigger items. As long as she left before the Germans came, there was no problem. That's how she rescued a lot of material. Okay, the poets that we mentioned were partisans, and they were able, thanks to that, to leave the ghetto before the Nazis dissolved it. In other words, the word was already out. The Nazis are liquidating the ghetto, and liquidating the ghetto means sending all of its inhabitants to camps, labor camps, death camps, or just mass murder sites. And they were able to leave the ghetto a week or 10 days before it was dissolved. They will go to the forests, they will fight against the Nazis, they will survive. The leaders of the paper brigade, the socialist, the religious Zionist, they both perished. Most of the members of the paper brigade perished. My estimate of 40, 30 perished. I only know of 8 names of people who survived. In a camp in Estonia known as Kluga. Rochel Krinsky, that mom who gave up her 1.5-year-old daughter to the nanny, survives, but under harrowing circumstances. She goes to this camp in Stutthof, near Danzig, or today Polish Gdansk, which is a labor camp that became a death camp. It was an overflow camp for Auschwitz. That is, in 1944, there were so many Hungarian Jews being sent to the Auschwitz death camp that you have to have overflow camps for the people sent there. And therefore, Stutthof did have a crematoria. It didn't have a gas chamber, but it did have, in other words, there were mass shootings, and then you put the bodies in the oven. And Rachel saw this daily and was just waiting for her turn. She was very lucky that her turn didn't come. She was liberated by the Soviets before her turn came. But she's a totally broken woman. She writes letters to her friends, the poets, and she says, I don't know why I survived. I don't know what the meaning of this life is. I see other survivors are starting to get married. I can't even imagine getting married or having love. The one positive feeling she has is she wants to reunite with her daughter. She says, it's not that I can do anything for my daughter in my current state, but maybe my daughter can help me. Maybe I will find some meaning to this life and some kind of energy if I reunite with my daughter. And she will struggle to do that. I'll come back. The poets return to Vilna with the Soviet Red Army in July 1944. The poets return and find the city totally in ruins, synagogues in ruins, the YIVO building in ruins. They come back not to look for their private property, not to look for friends because they know their friends and family are not alive. They come back to dig up the treasures that they hid, to finish the job, to dig up from the bunker and from other hiding places the papers, the books, and they create a kind of rescue operation. And whatever survivors there are that return to Vilna, a couple of hundred, participate in this kind of volunteer effort to dig up, sometimes with shovels, sometimes with their bare hands, the cultural treasures. And you can see a Torah scroll, that's Sutzkever in the middle again. And all kinds of art, newspapers, etc. And they create a Jewish museum in liberated Vilna in summer of 1944 for this material. They get a building. This is a courtyard. That courtyard had been used as, yes, the sports field of the Vilna ghetto. In other words, there were sports in the Vilna ghetto, and that's why you're seeing that. There are other images I just can't show you of basketball and gymnastics. And they use that building as the museum and the courtyard too, because there's so much material they're discovering, but it doesn't all fit in the building, and they keep it in the courtyard. The one thing they didn't keep in mind, or didn't think much about, is Vilnius is now part of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, while not Nazi Germany, is in this period, the late years of Joseph Stalin, is utterly opposed to any kind of Jewish cultural activity, let alone a Jewish museum or library. The head of the Lithuanian Bureau of the Communist Party, Mikhail Suslov, is dead set against this museum. And strange things start happening, like the sanitation department, the trash administration comes and takes away lots and lots of books and papers that were in the courtyard, as if it were trash. And that's when the poets realize our material must be rescued again, because it's no better under Mikhail Suslov as it was under Johannes Paul. In other words, no better shape. It's going to be destroyed by the Soviets the way it was destroyed by the Nazis. And that's when they decide they must smuggle the material again. out of the Soviet Union, out of Soviet Vilnius, to neighboring Poland, which is not yet, in 1945, a communist state. And they do that, in different ways. Lots of suitcases with false bottoms. They get to leave Soviet Lithuania for Poland because they're former Polish citizens. And dozens of people take suitcases with false bottoms. There are other means, and the material moves. Whatever they could take, they couldn't take it all. From Vilnius to Warsaw. Again, those are, on the left, the two poets now in Warsaw. From Poland, they move, again, they don't want to stay in Poland, to Paris. And the material eventually will end up, some of it in New York, some of it in Jerusalem. Rachel Krinsky goes from her camp to Poland and writes to her nanny and says, you're a Polish, ethnic Pole, you're a former Polish citizen, you can emigrate to Poland. Take my daughter to Poland and bring her to me. And the nanny agrees, and they meet up in Łódź in Poland, and she meets this girl who she hasn't seen in 4 years, right? That's it. From 1.5, it's now 5.5. The girl doesn't even know who this woman is. She calls her ma'am. She calls the nanny mommy. And it's a very difficult transition and a very difficult triangle because the nanny loves this girl. But eventually, both the nanny separates and the daughter accepts Rachela as her mom. She can write a letter to her friends and say, I am her mother again. The Jewish Museum is closed. Suslov had his way, and all the material that remained in this Jewish museum is dumped in Soviet repositories. And now we're back to the beginning of my talk. Most of the material was dumped in a former Catholic church, St. George's Church, where it lay in piles, covered up for 40 years. In other words, more than 40 years, from 1948 till our trip there in 1989. Nothing was done with that material that remained in Lithuania for 41 years. Now to wrap up, to finish up, I'm sorry, a little bit going past my time limit. I want to show you what did they rescue, what kind of things. I've been talking about books, papers, manuscripts. Some examples. A diary by Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, of the idea of a Jewish state. A diary from the 1880s. Now it's in New York. A record book of the synagogue of that great rabbi, the Vilna Gaon. The synagogue itself was destroyed, in ruins, but minutes book, which covers more than 150 years, from the late 18th century to the early 20th century. So it's a record book of meetings of the leadership of that synagogue for 150 years, was rescued. Letters by the great Yiddish writer Sholem Aleichem. Sholem Aleichem, who wrote Tevye the Dairyman, which later was adapted to become the Broadway hit Fiddler on the Roof. He wrote a lot of letters, very famous as a correspondent, and they were rescued by the Paper Brigade. A bust of Leon Tolstoy, done from life. In other words, Tolstoy posed to this young Jewish sculptor, Ilya Ginsburg. Okay, I'll just won't go into details. And a lot of material from the Holocaust period itself. That is, there was a whole archive of the Vilna Ghetto recording what's happening. And this is, for instance, only one document from that archive. a call for armed resistance in the Vilna ghetto. Do not go like sheep to the slaughter. It's a famous, which is now in Israel. So that gives you a sense of religious material, secular material, Holocaust material, all kinds. Sutzkever ended up settling in Israel. He actually got there before the state was declared in late 1947. Kaczerginski Shmerke settled in Buenos Aires. He was no longer a communist. He'd been totally disabused by the experience he had under Soviet rule. In Buenos Aires, he headed a Jewish culture organization, Congress for Jewish Culture, and he said, I know what devotion to culture means. Me and my colleagues in the paper brigade, we showed what devotion to Jewish culture means, and I promise to give you the same level of devotion as I showed in the ghetto. Rachel Akrinsky remarried in New York. She came to New York where she had relatives, met another survivor of the Vilna ghetto, and did the things she never imagined she would do, remarried. And raised her daughter, right, on the left of the right-hand picture, and lived to see her granddaughter, who lives in the Bay Area today. So to finish up, this is a different type of heroism. Heroism, for me, means someone who is willing to risk and even give their life for something bigger than them, for a noble cause bigger than them. These people were not trying to survive. They weren't smuggling food, they were smuggling books. It was a real choice they made to smuggle books, not food. They didn't think they're going to survive. They weren't doing this for themselves. They weren't doing this for their reading enjoyment. They were doing it for the future, for a future generation. They believed that there would be a future for the Jewish people, and that future generation and mankind in general needed this material. There is no life without culture, without books, without history, without religion. And so they put that above their own personal survival. It was an existential choice. It was a choice. I want to spend the last weeks of my life doing something meaningful. If I'm going to die, I want to die because I smuggled a rare book, not because I smuggled a bag of peas. And with that kind of dedication, they did what seems extraordinary and impossible. And we should all think about that as an example. All of us, we're not called to do acts of heroism, but whatever we can do, whether it's to perpetuate the Jewish tradition and the Jewish heritage, or whether it's to support the world of the spirit, whether that's music, or whether that's scholarship, or whether that's literature, we should do our part, because we're not being asked to do what the paper brigade did, but every one of us should participate in the effort to perpetuate culture. Thank you very much.
For questions, and we'll come around with mics so that you can ask your questions. Does anyone have a question?
So the picture that you showed of from 1989 of all of those books, which were no longer piled, they at that point had been somewhat organized, or at least dusted off. So was that the people of Vilnius who had done that? Like who, and non-Jews, Jews, both?
By the time we came, no, that former church was now a book repository. It was the Lithuanian National Book Chamber. So it had all kinds of books. The Jewish books were never cataloged and had been lying in mountains. But before we came, they were embarrassed. The Lithuanians were embarrassed. Well, it's a mixture of embarrassed and blaming the Russians. So they did what they could by the time we got there to put a lot of it up on the shelves.
I know from having read the book that there were books in a lot of other places other than the church. Some of them were actually buried. I don't know who the burier thought would come along and know to dig a foot deep and find the book. But do you think there's still a lot of stuff over there, and is anybody looking for it?
Yes, not everything was retrieved. There were hiding places for books that were, as you said, buried underground. Well, like if another building fell on top of that space or a building was ruined, there was no way to retrieve. There were, at that point, in 1945, 44, 45, so not a lot of places, you know, and also a very limited number of people who remembered exactly where different hiding places were. The bunker survived. The short answer is yes, I'm sure there is material still under the ground somewhere in the city of Vilnius. But it's hard to look for at this late stage. Every time I go to Vilnius often, I see that they're doing some work to repair the sewage system or to repair the telephone system. You know, you do see, I keep hoping, you know, that, all right, they're digging and somebody will find a hiding place, but it hasn't happened yet.
All right. So you mentioned that, you know, all these books were in this book repository. How well known was the story to those who were taking care of the books? How aware were they of their history?
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. No, the story as I told it to you, of course they didn't know. But they knew, well, the director of this book repository, because not all the staff knew anything even, but the director knew this is what, two simple facts. This is the material we got from the Jewish Museum when it was closed. And this is the remnants of Jewish libraries from Vilnius before the war. Those are the two things they knew. And they knew, okay, let me take this opportunity to explain, that it was valuable. I don't know, they sensed that it was valuable. I don't think they knew, but they sensed that it was valuable. Because, you know, I'm skipping a lot, but at a certain point in 1949, Jewish books were destroyed in the Soviet Union everywhere. Yiddish, Hebrew, even Russian language. And the order was given also to this institution to destroy the books. And the director, also an ethnic Lithuanian, instead of destroying the books, hid them in his own repository, rather than destroy them. And even he said, and then later, all right, years later, he said, they'll build a monument for me in Israel because, you know, for what I did in rescuing Jewish culture. So the director is another hero in this story of not destroying it when Stalin's orders were to destroy it.
So I was wondering, I'm assuming that you've read a good bit of the texts that you've found or worked on, and I was wondering, Was there anything that you found that was saved that to you personally was, meaningful or something that stuck out to you?
That's a hard one. First of all, I'm a historian, so everything is really important to me. I'm sorry if I'll disappoint you. For me, the most poignant thing was not an item I found, but the people I found in 1989. There were older Jews who still knew Yiddish, still knew some Hebrew, but hadn't been able to really read books in those languages in 40 years of Soviet rule, and were rediscovering their childhood identity. And one woman who worked there, because they started to catalog this material, the woman who worked there, who graduated from a Yiddish school in the class of June 1941, in other words, the very last graduating class before the Nazis came in. This woman and I had the same teacher. All right, she had the teacher in the 1930s, and I had the teacher in the 1970s. All right? I studied with him at that time in Israel. She studied with him in Kaunas, Lithuania. But still, to realize that we'd never met each other before, but we had the same teacher, that was for me the most poignant thing. And here we are together, such different life stories, hers much more painful than mine. Hers much more painful. She's the only surviving member of her family. That was for me the most poignant thing. It wasn't about a paper or a book. It was about the person I met at that moment. Let me just clarify one thing I didn't explain, but I was thinking about this today. How many people survived the Vilna Ghetto? I never said that in the talk. Under 1,000. All right? So what I'm telling you is if there were 70,000 Jews in Vilna before the Germans came, among those who, but 1,000, no more, survived. So we're talking about 1.5% survived the ghetto. So those people, that's why I'm stressing, those, for me, maybe just as much to cherish were not only the books, but the people. I'll just say more generally, Lithuania has the lowest survival rate in the entire Holocaust. That was 97% of Jews of Lithuania perished. 3% of the Jews of Lithuania survived. I mean, I'm sorry, we historians do this very gruesome kind of math. Only 75% of French Jewry survived. 75% of Italian Jewry survived. But only 3% of Lithuanian Jewry survived. All right, so, okay, just to reiterate my point.
I think we have time for one more question.
Well, I don't know how serious, it may be someone after me, but I'm really particularly interested in what you were talking about, and I'm really impressed, and thank you very much for sharing all of this. I have my grandparents on my mother's side came from Lithuania, but on my father's side, they came from Romania. And I wonder if I've been doing a lot of family research. There's a Grisey in our temple who has a son who's been helping us with doing some research. How much is anything being done in Romania like this, where they look for documents, books, papers, like you've obviously done here, or is it just pretty much confined to Vilna?
Well, this work was confined to Vilna. There are grassroots efforts, to find Jewish heritage.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at is with Russia doing what it's doing in the Ukraine now, will there be more things being lost to what is happening in Ukraine as a result of
definitely.
the world?
That's already happening. There have been archives that have been hit by Russian missiles. And when an archive is hit, archives are more important than libraries, forgive me, because archival documents are usually unique. Books get printed in hundreds and thousands of copies, but archival documents, usually there's one copy. And they're not so technologically advanced as we are, the Ukrainians, with digitization. And if an archive is hit, that's it. History has been lost for perpetuity, and that's a topic that concerns me a great, great deal. Okay, well, thank you. I'll be happy to answer questions privately.